So welcome to our next panel, ladies and gentlemen, the emerging cross-border trust services market. We have Rachelle Sellung, the senior scientist at the University of Stuttgart, Fraunhofer. Rachelle is a senior scientist in the competence team of identity management at the University of Stuttgart. She provides the economic perspective for not only identity management, but a variety of IT security-related technologies. She contributed a socio-economic perspective in the large-scale EU FP7 project Future ID, which she developed an identity management infrastructure for Europe. We're delighted to have you here, Rachelle. Thank you. We're also delighted to see you here, Victor Martin, Deputy Manager from the Business Development and Strategy at Correos. So lovely to see you here, Victor. Victor is responsible for the development of new business related to postal services, parcels, delivery, logistics, and digital services from Correos, our post office in Spain. Lovely to see you here, Victor. Thank you very much. Delighted also to welcome to the panel Hans Graux. Hans is an IT lawyer at the Brussels-based law firm Timelex. Timelex specializes in information and technology law in the broadest sense. The team is internationally recognized, both being a legal 500 top tier in information technology and a Chambers Europe recommended firm for TMT in information technology. He's participated in a large number of international IC policy studies, primarily for the European Commission and various European agencies. And together, both Rachelle, Hans, and Victor are from the Lotus project, a 3-year EU-funded project. OIX is one of its partners, and its main role is that of globally communicating the project's progress and ensuring European input from the rest of the world as it's looking at a global solution that might help drive interoperability. So they're all contributing to that, and here on this panel perspective today. So welcome, thank you very much. So, Dan Johnson, Head of Digital Identity at HSBC. Lovely to see you, Dan. Dan is concentrating on reimagining customer data management and redefining HSBC's digital identity strategy. His career spans 20 years, predominantly in financial services, but includes in working with commercial and public sectors. It's great to see you here, Dan. Thank you. And Richard Thompson. Richard is the Business Development Lead for IDEMIA. Richard is responsible for the citizens' identity business development activities for IDEMIA in the UK. He's previously held business development positions at IDEMIA in the telecoms division and established telecoms applications and solutions programs. It's lovely to see you here, Richard. So thank you very much. And both Richard and Dan are here to talk to us today from a CEF project, Connecting Europe Facility EU funding, on opening a bank account across borders with an EU national identity project. Okay, so thank you very much. So we're delightful to hear both panels' perspectives in just a second. So OIX are involved in these two projects, and much longer than the normal sort of 3 to 4 month kind of narrow focus small bites to really see if they can achieve a result. Lotus is a 3-year EU-funded project, and OIX is one of the partners, and the main role of that is, as we mentioned, globally communicating the projects and ensuring the European input. Opening a bank account across borders with an EU national digital identity, the CEF project, is also an EU-funded project. 1 year that OIX are project managing is the next step from an earlier project, Digital Identity Across Borders. So a little bit of background before our speakers give us much more detail. I'm going to first ask Rachelle to present and share a little bit about Lotus.
Hi, my name is Rachelle Sellung. I'm a senior scientist at the University of Stuttgart. It's a pleasure to be here today, so thank you. So the Lotus project, as already mentioned, it's an EU project. It's running 3 years, and it's being led by Fraunhofer Institute in Germany. It's one of the largest research institutions in Europe. And it's the head of identity management for the Fraunhofer Institution. And it's being worked together with an array of different partners for this EU project, ranging from industry leaders such as IBM and Atos, but also has a wide range of partners who are also from academics, so universities, and research institutions, and together we all have a similar goal. However, our perspectives can sometimes vary greatly, but hopefully we'll come to a successful or satisfactory conclusion. Yes, so we are currently under the Horizon 2020 initiative for the European Commission and this project. Also, we just finished our first year of the project, where we first established a reference architecture for what we would like to build, which I'll get to in a second, and we still have about 2 years left. Right now, the second year, we're working on the implementation of what we just planned out, and then in the last year, we will have 2 pilots. So basically, what we would like to do in the Lotus project is we want to build a global trust infrastructure based on an open source license. This infrastructure will have 3 main functions. The first function is verification. So as you can probably hear, I'm actually an American, so I know kind of silly for being in a EU project, but anyways, so yes, I studied in Germany, so I did my master's there. However, in order to do this, the application process, I needed to prove to them that I actually had a bachelor's from the US. I studied at the University of Mississippi, so Ole Miss, if anybody by chance knows that university. So anyways, so I had to provide them with my diploma. And in order to do this, where they would actually take it as a real diploma, I had to get 3 or 4 different notarizations from the US and also in Germany before they would be like, okay, this is a real document, we accept this, and you can go further along in the application process. As you probably can understand, this process is not the quickest and also not the easiest. And with Lotus, you could theoretically also use the Lotus technology to be like, okay, so I, as the University of Hohenheim, that's where I did my master's, they trust all diplomas that are from the US that are supported by the US Department of Education. So the US Department of Education may have a list of universities that are accredited, and if the University of Mississippi would be on this list, then you could use this tool. Okay, this is a real university, and you can go further along with this process. Going on to the second function would be translation, which I guess is quite interesting for this panel particularly, especially with the cross-borders market. And for translation, going a little bit along my theme of diplomas and struggles, right? So another thing is in the US, we have a 4-point scale, right? So 4.0 is an A, and a 1.0, I guess, is a D or barely passing. And in Germany, it's an inverted scale. So a 4.0 is wonderful in the US, A+, great, but in Germany, you're barely passing, and you're definitely not going to get in that program. So with the Lotus tool, you could also theoretically say, okay, so I, as a university, would like to translate these American scales to our scales using the German-approved, or German Department of Education-approved translation method, so then it goes a lot faster. Right now, it's being done where I had to send it to some random town in Germany where they would manually do it, and they would literally go through each and every course and then compare how this should be done and what could actually be translated. And the nice thing about Lotus is that another kind of crucial part for the cross-borders services part is that it's not necessarily bilateral. So the Germans and the Americans, they would not have to agree on how the translation would be done. So the Germans could be like, okay, so she had a 3.5 or like a B, or I don't know, an A, an A in the US. However, yeah, we think it's much harder here in Germany, so that's only a B+, right? So, I mean, as an American, I would be quite sad, but the Germans could do that, and the Americans would not have to say anything about it. However, the Americans also could create their own translation method, and you don't need this agreement, because a lot of the problems that we have here is, okay, so we both have very different opinions. Okay, let's talk about it, and there's never a conclusion, but with this tool, there wouldn't need to be a conclusion. Like, they just have their own individual translations, and then that's it. But yeah, so that's the second function of the tool or the technology that we're building. And the last one is delegation. This one is basically, an example of this would be a purchase order. So I am Rachelle Sellung. I would like to purchase 1,000,000 pens for 5,000 euros or whatever in the name of the University of Stuttgart. Okay, so as a senior scientist, of course, I have no rights at all to purchase anything. So they could see in this purchasing order, they would have to check, okay, so Rachelle Sellung wants to buy however many pens for a ridiculous amount, or I don't even know how much pens cost, so whatever. But anyways, and then they would say, okay, she does not have the right to do this, so of course we're going to reject this admission or whatnot, and then I would not be able to purchase all of my pens. So yeah, so that's the last function that this tool would be doing. So yeah, so just to kind of give an illustration to this kind of complex global trust infrastructure world. Yes. And okay, so with that, you can kind of see, okay, so with these three functions, they're kind of, I don't know, a fundamental part of this digitalization process, right? And as we've heard from this morning that, yeah, it's kind of complex, and okay, so we have all these problems, what are we going to do? And we're thinking, okay, so when we wanted to think of different use cases, actually these three basic functions can be found in so many different use cases, ranging from the private sector of banking or shipping industry, or also in the public sector for e-health. So another thing we're looking into, of course, is e-health. So if I have a German insurance, however, if I would be traveling in Spain and I would get hurt, then they could check, okay, so do I have an insurance that would be also supported in Spain if I have my German insurance. We have two pilots that we are implementing in the project. One is done by Correos, the Spanish Postal Service, and then the other one is done by IBM. And yes, so that, I guess, is where I will conclude with my brief introduction.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Richard Thompson, and I'm from IDEMIA. IDEMIA was previously known as OT Morpho, also known as Morpho, also known as Saffron Identity and Security. So it seems entirely appropriate that I'm here at an identity conference. So I'd first like to thank the OIX for inviting me here to speak on this panel, and I'd also like to thank Barclays and Sarah Monroe for putting on a fantastic event today. I'm sure you'll agree. So the topic of this session is the emerging cross-border trust services market. So I've been asked to say a few words about an EU-funded project that Barclays, HSBC, Orange France, France Connect, ourselves, IDEMIA, who I explained earlier, are involved in. I've condensed the project down to a few slides to give you a feel for what it is. In case anyone was concerned, we do have some very lengthy presentations on this, and I'm happy to deliver it to almost, well, anybody who wants to listen. Okay, what I want to cover in the next few minutes is the project and those involved and what they're doing. The project aims to define the commercial, the technical, the regulatory frameworks that would allow a French citizen to use their French digital identity in the UK, and allow a UK bank to be sure that the French person in front of them, online as it was, is who they actually say they are when applying for financial services in the UK. I tend to think of this as, and it's probably not a great metaphor, but a passporting of an identity into the UK. Or, given my background in the telecommunications industry, I like to think as a French ID roaming. So, back to my roots. So hopefully the issues around this topic will set a good backdrop for the conversations of the panel session later on. But before I describe the project, I thought that I'd just share some interesting facts with you that illustrate the problem that the project aims to solve. So I think, Sarah, you touched on these statistics earlier, so apologies for being repetitious. A total of 4.7 million people immigrated into one of the 28 EU member states in 2015. 2.4 million citizens were from non-EU countries. 1.4 million people were in countries where they didn't have a citizenship of where they'd migrated to. So this shows there's a lot of people on the move around the EU, and nearly half of them come from outside of the EU. I actually thought the number would be bigger myself, but there we go. Of course, each one of these individuals, when they come to a country, have their own identity needs, not at home and in the destination country. For things like, renting an apartment, because an address is quite fundamental to your identity. And if you can't prove your identity to get a rent because the credit's going to be guaranteed, they've got problems. To buy a car, and of course, as we've been talking today, to open a bank account, to place children into schools. And of course, anybody who has adolescent children, to get broadband and Wi-Fi is fundamental to a sensible lifestyle. Of course, also to register with a local authority for very pragmatic things like getting the bins collected at the end of the week. Each one of these individuals wants a smooth journey to get to a place where they can use these services to run their lives. They don't want to just use the service, they want to run their lives securely and safely. And of course, a bank account opening is the subject of this project. And a good number of the 4.7 million individuals that I just mentioned will need a bank account. So what happens today? 50% of new bank account applications are from overseas individuals in the UK today. Sarah, you mentioned that earlier. Now, I know there are other representatives here of banks and financial institutions, so I suspect that this has some resonance with them for their products and services. All of these applications can take many weeks to complete, gathering the right information, checking it. The individual may not have what the bank needs. It may have information that the bank doesn't need, but it probably has information in the format that in a format that the bank can't accept. All of these applications for bank accounts take many weeks to complete. Not all are successful, so the big question is, how can we make this better for people? At least making it so sufficiently better for them that they can actually receive a check for their salary from their employer, employment being the most fundamental reason why people move from one country to another. So as I mentioned earlier, the project aims to propose a solution where a French citizen opening a bank account in the UK who may not have a proof of residence in the UK, how do they do it? And of course, address, as I mentioned earlier, is one of the most important attributes that makes up an individual's identity, from which other forms of identity are derived from. So the intention of the project is to leverage existing national identity infrastructure in France with attributes, and to consume the identity in the UK as part of their customers' or banks' onboarding process. To achieve this, we are reusing as many building blocks as possible to create an infrastructure to deliver this objective. EIDAS, OpenID Connect, the GSMA's Mobile Connect, and the IDP services from France Connect. Okay, so that's a very quick overview of the project. And as I was only supposed to have 2 slides, or even 1 slide, from when Sue requested my presentation here, I guess I've probably also overrun. But I have just 1 more slide to finish up with, and as I said at the beginning, I wanted to just quickly describe who does what. There we go. Okay, so France Connect provide with Orange France the national ID, so that France Connect are the IDP. Orange France bring the GSMA Mobile Connect implementation for the authentication mechanism. The UK government will provide guidance, governance, advice, particularly around the EIDAS subject, and Barclays and HSBC are giving guidance on how they could want to consume a French identity and the attributes associated with that identity for onboarding their customers. We at IDEMIA, of course I have to plug the company, are developing a network of federation infrastructure that glues it all together, including an EIDAS compliant infrastructure for the private sector. So I hope that gives you a sense of what we're trying to achieve with the project here and the benefits that it will obviously bring to many EU citizens. Well, we will certainly hope so. When the project is complete, they will be reporting to the EU and findings and proposals on a way forward. That's all I'd like to say right now, and I'm sure you'll all have some really good questions, and thank you very much for listening.
So Rachel, that was really interesting to hear and understand, and you did mention so many benefits, but I wanted to pull out particularly, what are the key benefits of businesses who wish to use Lotus?
Well, I think one of the largest benefits is that it's a global structure. So one that we're trying to not just keep it in the EU, but also to attend to some of the needs globally. So like, as I mentioned before with this translation, we're also looking to see, okay, so how may EIDAS be translated into the American NIST standard and whatnot, and this might be useful for businesses as well. But also I think just the general concept of shortening some of these very bureaucratic processes that are in companies right now.
What potential use cases are there for using Lightest, specifically across cross-border trust services, other than the one that you ran through?
A lot of them have to do, are related with basic cross-border certifications. So whether or not it's a diploma or a driver's license or a certain type of certificate that's maybe accepted in Spain, but maybe you have to do some extra things in order for it to be recognized in Germany. Another one, we also looked into cross-border banking a bit to help with the certification process. Okay, so if I have a bank in the US and maybe this bank is supported in Germany, if maybe, okay, so I trust the US Bank of America, and if she is a participant or a customer of the Bank of America, then she can maybe open up a bank account at the Deutsche Bank in Germany. But yeah, so we've looked at some of these use cases also with e-health or like these e-services that the European Union is pushing, as I mentioned with like e-health. So to also, okay, so if I have an insurance in Germany, if it's recognized in Spain, but also if I have a prescription in Germany and maybe I'm traveling abroad and I need to get that prescription again, then they could check, okay, so this is a prescription that was filled in Germany, and okay, so we can fulfill that, but we can only go up to these standards. So maybe I could get, I don't know, what's Tylenol or something in Germany, and I get 50 pills, or I have no idea, and then I go to Spain and they're only allowed to give me 30 in comparison to, so this is where the translation could also come in. So yeah, it's quite a range.
So Hans, the European legislation on trust services, the IDES regulation, entered into force about 1.5 years ago. What have been the major impacts, if any?
Well, I think what we've seen in practice, and this is also very important for the Lightest project, is that within market for trust services, there's a lot more awareness and a lot more visibility of the possibility of cross-border trade. And this is something where the IDES model for supervision, for creating trust lists of accredited service providers has helped a lot. And this is something that we've actually seen several situations already in practice, where companies are in the market for buying trust services, timestamps, electronic signatures. They specifically want to have EIDAS compliant trust service providers, not because they love the EIDAS regulation so much, but because it sets a baseline that's comparable for all of the countries, and it takes away part of the compliance burden. And we've seen several instances already where clients or businesses who want to buy trust services say, well, actually, it doesn't matter very much whether they're established in my home market or not. They can be from any other member state as long as it's EIDAS compliant. So I think that's been a very beneficial impact on the market in terms of setting the bar at the same height for all of these service providers across the European Union. And that has been beneficial, I think, in opening up the markets, also in creating some visibility. For people who want to know how that works, if you just Google trusted list browser, then that'll take you to a website where you can find all the accredited supervised trust service providers in the European Union. So if you want to know where you can go for e-signatures or for seals or for timestamps that are EIDAS compliant, that's where you go to find them. And it's a childishly simple thing, but this is a good example, by the way, of the kind of stuff that we're trying to do with Lightest as well. If you have this harmonized trust scheme and you can come up with a list of comparable services, that really enables the market. It really creates a lot of competition. It opens access to markets for some of these trust service providers. So this is something that's been done with that mechanism, and that's also kind of what we're trying to replicate in other contexts with Lightest as well.
Thank you, that's very helpful. And global interoperability remains challenging. However, what are the main legal reasons and how could they be solved?
Well, so one of the reasons why within the Lotus project we're working with European trust services is because there is a clear homogeneous trust framework. There are clear rules that are defined at the European level, and we have legislation on that makes sure that this is applied across the European Union. The same thing isn't true if you go outside of the European market. Legislation on electronic signatures typically will exist, but obviously in most cases it won't follow the specific European model, so you can't know for certain that trust service providers established outside of the European Union use the same kind of rules on accountability and responsibility verifications that need to be done as in the European Union. So, and also the system that I mentioned earlier, the trust lists that you do have in all European member states, those don't necessarily exist in other countries either. So that's one of the big gaps, the disparity, I would say, in regulatory approach to trust services. We have our own very specific philosophy and very specific model that seems to be working well. It's still early days yet because the regulation only entered into force in the middle of last year, but seems to be working well provisionally. The same thing isn't true for international markets. And this is also where we're trying to, let's say, innovate a little bit with the Lotus project. We're trying to create, like Rachel said, sort of the global trust infrastructure. We want to use that through the domain name system, since that's, the domain name system is used globally. It is trusted as a technical infrastructure. If you can use that kind of infrastructure for communicating information on which trust service providers are in fact trustworthy, determining equivalence with them, then that could fill a policy void without having to wait for new legislation, new regulation. That would be very valuable, we think.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very helpful. Is the current legal framework sufficient to sustain a digital economy? And what else do you think is needed?
I think it put a couple of very valuable building blocks in place. It has ensured that we have equivalent rules on electronic identification within the European Union, on electronic signatures, seals, timestamps, the electronic registered delivery services. But there are still quite a few gaps that I think need to be addressed. If you look at digitization of paper documents, there are no rules for that at the European level. And the same for electronic archiving. Those are issues that are, in the best case scenario, regulated at the national level, worst case scenario, not regulated at all, which is not very practical if you're an international company. Since then, if you want to start doing electronic archiving, you have to start checking on a country-by-country basis what is feasible and hope that you don't get conflicting responses. At a minimum, it's very inefficient. Realistically, it's also something that isn't really tenable in the long term. So I would expect that we get new categories of trust services in the future, specifically for things like digitization and electronic archiving that are necessary to be able to fully do away with paper documents and with analog environments.
Good, thank you. So it's very inspiring. So thank you very much for your points, Hans. Victor, I'd love you to tell us a bit about the Lotus pilot projects that are planned.
Well, it's quite easy. We are the laboratory rabbit. Fraunhofer is going to experiment with us their investigations. No. In Spain, we are making digital identity services. It's basically connecting the real, well, I will explain it later in the next panel, but connecting real life with digital life and public administration and some professional systems. And then Lotus is the opportunity for us to understand how we have to work to make it standard, or at least with compatibilities with the rest of the world. For us, it's very interesting, all the translation systems, because, okay, we are working locally with our local laws and with our local systems, public systems, but at the same time, we want to have a mirror, a window to Europe and the States, and that's where Lotus is important for us.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. That's great to understand that. And then, what stage are your projects at?
Sorry?
What stage are they at? Can you give us any more detail about
our systems in Spain?
Just the stage of the project. Are you at experimentation, implementation?
No, we are in a study right now, because what we are showing them our systems, and they are understanding how we work, so they can connect the system.
Okay.
So it's just in laboratory stage.
Yes, okay. Like proving the concept works.
Yeah.
Okay. Dan, the IDES regulation is focused on public sector usage of identity. What's the most effective way to move the principles into the private sector regulation, whether that's mandating compliance or private public sector partnerships, please?
So this is this is just my opinion.
That's perfectly okay. We'd like your opinion.
And that is public-private sector partnerships are really the way forward. So mandating regulation or mandating compliance on the private sector is not, in my opinion, going to be particularly effective. Certainly, organizations will achieve a sufficient level of compliance. But actually what we're talking about here is really kind of moving the dial and doing something really cool and interesting and will be fantastically useful for consumers. And the way to do that really is, and this has kind of been reflected through pretty much everybody's speeches today, is really finding really compelling citizen propositions, getting the citizen involved, and really, organizations provide services to those citizens. And it's really working out what they are, and then what needs to be provided in a regulatory framework to allow that to happen in a safe and private way. That's really where the magic happens. It's not something that private sector can do outside of government or regulation, and it's not something that government can do to the private sector. It's something that has to happen collectively.
Thank you. Thank you for your opinion on that. IDES focuses on identity and not the additional attributes that identity could unlock that will provide real value to citizens and reliant parties. How do you see the attribute exchange network unfolding?
It's a good one. So I think that the importance really is to understand who a person is. And until you really understand who a person is, it's quite difficult really to do anything more with that person. So fundamentally at the core is really understanding that you are you. Once we have that understood, then you can start to do something much more interesting. So knowing that somebody is who they say they are, it's not that helpful, actually. Just on its own, that's not really that helpful. What's really helpful is if you can then share, as Sarah was mentioning earlier, using technologies such as zero-knowledge proof, where you're not actually sharing data, you're just sharing attestations, or you're sharing knowledge about something. That's where it becomes really interesting from a citizen perspective. So dealing with stuff that people want to do and that they find really difficult to do right now, making that much more easy. So in my mind, first thing is crack identity, and then after that, work out how to then provide additional data to just take the friction out of people's lives and let them do things like open bank accounts, buy products online, file their taxes, and do all of those other things, sometimes that we have to do, and often things that we want to do, and do that in a much frictionless way.
Richard, the project has great intentions and will show how cross-border ID can be used. What are the next steps once this project has been completed to make it real?
Well, the project is kind of creating a pilot, a straw man, looking at the technical commercial aspects of what needs to be in place for this to happen. So, like all good things in the private sector, there has to be some commercial benefit behind it, and I think that is at the root of it. And because an identity provider is creating value by creating an identity, and as I think Nick very well articulated this morning about what an IDP has to do to create that value. Once that value is created, then what can a business do with that? And if it is something that saves them money or saves them time and gives their customer a better experience, then that is the case behind it. So there's work to be done on the business case as to who is this going to work for. And thinking back to the discussion this morning with Rob Yule from the ABI, when you're working in the pensions industry, anything you do with the fund costs the fund. So you don't want to pay for lots of money for identifying people. But on the other hand, if you're doing a high value transaction and you're saving 2-3 weeks, kind of as the way I described in my opening, solving a lot of problems, then there is a business case there. So it needs to be, the business case needs to find its best seated homes in companies.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And this is a project that's driven by two of the world's largest banks. And I know today's focus has been on the financial sector, and I can see the advantages for them and others in the financial sectors. But what other sectors do you see the service being useful for too?
Well, like Dan, my opinion is...
opinions are welcome.
Yeah, is that I have a concern that digital identity becomes wrapped up in the financial services sort of sector box in terms of how it's perceived by citizens. It's a relatively dry subject compared to some other things that you can do in life. I often think of my two elder boys who are over 18 but have to prove their age quite frequently. And I think of a dynamic where they might want to have some friends round. And they might need to send out to a supermarket to get a home delivery of some over 18 products, alcohol. So they will need to...
alcohol.
So they will need to prove their age online. And of course, pressing the button that says, I am over 18 and I'm using a verified identity underpinned by the government is probably a very good way of going forward.
There are a number of other projects looking at this international use of identity too. How has this been coordinated with organisations?
Well, part of the work of the alpha stage of the project, and I speak under caution from Harry Webber-Brown, who is the project manager, who is shuffling us all along and making us do all of our tasks and actions. But during the early stages of this project, many groups have been consulted on, kind of their opinions and thoughts on the best way forward. So hopefully we're reaching a point where there's a consensus that what we're going to turn out at the end will actually, everyone will say, yeah, that's what we were looking for. So touch wood.
And one of the things that I find particularly appealing about this project is having attended a number of fantastic conferences just like this one, I find that often we just talk about stuff. This was a real opportunity, and working with Barclays as well, a real opportunity to just get going and do it. And yet, there are going to be problems. There are going to be things that we didn't really anticipate. Probably on almost everybody's mind is the kind of question, and I'm sure I'm going to get a question about this later on as well, about liability and exactly how that's going to work. If I'm brutally honest, we don't know. But despite the fact that we don't know, that's not giving us a reason not to do this. We're going to figure this stuff out. We've got some fantastically intelligent people. We're working within the Open Identity Exchange, which is also connected into even more fantastically intelligent people who are helping us work all of this stuff out. So this is just a great opportunity to just get going and get it done, figure it out as we go.
Get stuck in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Love it. Thank you very much. Thank you. Can we have a big hand for the panel, please? Really